Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Andy Johnson, President of Friends of the Bethel University Library. Welcome to Primetime at the Bethel University Library. Primetime is a collaborative project between the Friends of the Bethel University Library, the Faculty Development Office, and many other offices on campus. It celebrates the learning beyond the classroom through the experiences and accomplishments of Bethel faculty, students, and staff. I have the honor this morning of emceeing this year's Friends of the Library Awards, and there are two awards today, the Connie Larson Memorial Scholarship and the Library Research Prize. Before we present these awards, we'd like to say a couple of thank yous.
I'm Rhonda Gilbray, and as always, we want to make a special thank you to Anna Gannon for her tireless work in coordinating all the primetime presentations in the library, and to Bob Kistler, who faithfully records them all so that people can view them later and share them with friends. And then additional thanks to Jean Kenny and Randy Swanson and various other staff who helped to set up and take down and all that kind of good stuff. Hanging posters, monitoring the sound, etc. This year we want to make a couple special thank yous to members of the Friends Board who are stepping down after terms of faithful service. The first of these is Erling Warner, who's been a friend of she's been a member of the Friends Board since she began working here in 2003, and she's done so much that it's really hard to enumerate it all, but I'm going to try. She served as treasurer, she's coordinated the Library Research Prize and the Connie Larson Scholarship, she served as membership coordinator, she's regularly contributed to the Friends newsletter, she's helped to coordinate numerous events, and on and on. She's gone on to assume the very important responsibility of being the coordinator of our zero-cost resource program for some of our CAPS programs, and we want to take this opportunity this morning to let her know how very much we appreciate her innumerable contributions to the Friends over the years.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for your excellent work. Hi, I'm David. I'm the Director of Libraries. And I just want to echo everything that Rhonda said. Really work in bringing these events to pass every year has been tireless and quiet behind the scenes, and couldn't have done it without what everyone's done. So thank you so very much.
And lastly, we want to thank Andy Johnson, who is stepping down as the Friends President at the end of May. We're sad to see him go. He's been supportive, resourceful, superior networker, and our #1 cheerleader. Thank you, Andy, for the work you've done on our behalf, and don't be a stranger. Okay, so we have a little something for you.
Yeah. Andy's done a terrific job, and I'm sure that he will be willing to serve as a consultant for whoever the next president is. Is that right? Unpaid consultant. Thanks, Andy. Unfailing source of encouragement and insight and perspectives and good ideas during his tenure, and we're very grateful for the work he's done to set things up well for the next president.
Okay, now it's my great pleasure to announce to you the newest award member of the Connie Larson Scholarship. In 2009, the Friends of the Library organization established this annual scholarship in memory of Connie J. Larson, a reference librarian here at the Bethel University Library, in commemoration of her service and in celebration of her dedication to training, supervising, and development of student library assistants. The scholarship is awarded each year to a student who's working in the Bethel University Library who exemplifies an attitude of service. The 2019 recipient of the Connie Larson Memorial Scholarship is Jake Van Lowe. Now, Jake's supervisor, Kent Gerber, is eager to share with you some of the reasons he was nominated and selected to receive this award.
Yeah. All right. So congratulations, Jake. You're about that.
Okay, so 2 years ago, first, I'm Kent Gerber, digital library manager, and I oversee the Makerspace. And 2 years ago, as the Makerspace was just starting out and the first Makerspace student graduated, I was wondering what would come next in this crucial, formative time for the Makerspace. And art design professor, as I was asking around, art design professor Jesse Henderson recommended Jake Van Lowe as a great candidate, and I am so grateful that I took her recommendation. Jake's a pleasure to supervise, and he is a large reason why the Makerspace has continued to grow and thrive as it has. He jumps into every task I ask him to do with energy and enthusiasm, and he does an excellent job. He usually has some suggestion or other angle that enriches any idea or task that I ask him to do. We are fortunate to have the benefits of his talents as a photographer and designer as well. He takes excellent pictures and has developed the branding for the Makerspace as well, coming up with ideas to improve and tweak the Makerspace for the benefit of students and everybody. He is very generous and gentle as he shares his talents. He created the button maker template we use, designed a set of Halloween-themed buttons for our do-it-yourself fest. He also designed, here's an example of like the branding for the Makerspace. There's a lot of subtle as well as very clear signals in here. And then also outside of the Makerspace, we've also benefited from his talents for a very clever design for poetry, poem in your pocket design. So he exhibits excellent customer service by greeting anyone who comes in and helping whenever he sees there's a need or is asked. And often tour groups come by, and the student tour guides have even gotten into the habit of pointing to him and asking him to explain the space to people, which he does very succinctly and invitingly, which is always results in an expression of pleasure from the students or from the parents who are visiting as well. And lastly, he patiently and inquiringly helps anyone who needs it in the Makerspace and encourages people to try new things and experiment. He's always curious, and he asks good questions, making him an excellent fit for the library and its ethos of supporting and encouraging curiosity and lifelong learning. So congratulations, Jake, well deserved.
Now we would like to present the Library Research Prize Award. The purpose of the prize is to promote undergraduate research through the curriculum and to encourage excellence in student research that makes substantial use of library resources and services and demonstrates understanding of information literacy competencies. The winner of the 2019 Library Research Prize is Sarah Bylsma.
Sarah, congratulations.
Very good. And Sarah will now share with us a presentation about her winning research. Thank you.
We're looking forward to it.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. Okay. As Mr. Johnson said, my name is Sarah Bylsma. I am a Reconciliation Studies and Political Science double major. Thanks, Dr. May. And I'm from Anchorage, Alaska. And I really appreciate the people who have come to support me in person as my family cannot be here today. So with that, I will get going. I'm going to start by introducing how this project came to be, and then I'll talk about how the library and resources were so crucial to its success. And then I will get into the actual content and findings of my project. So last J-term, I had a couple experiences in a class. They were not overt or malicious, but there was some gendered behavior, and I didn't even notice it until I was reflecting upon it later. And I was in some small group discussion with 4 other students, all of which were men, and I was always the group scribe. And so I took that on, and none of us questioned it. And I didn't think about it until later, and I was like, oh, that's maybe, there might be something else going on there. And then I also had, in that same class, my professor, at some point we got talking about women running for public office and how women often self-select out of that. And so he said, ladies, run for office. And that kind of stuck with me. So then as the spring semester started, I had the opportunity to do this project for my qualitative research methods class with Dr. Harley Schreck. And this topic and area kept coming up. And so that's the direction I went with. And I really wanted it to be about hearing about the experiences of my female peers and how our department was doing, more than like combing for whether something was positive or negative. I really wanted to hear about those experiences. So where the library and its resources really came into play for this was at the very beginning of our research. Dr. Schreck had us come in and we did an informational session with the research librarians, and they went through all the different resources and how to use them and stuff like that. And this was building on similar times of that that I had in the past, whether that was in humanities or other political science classes. And every time I was in one of those, I learned something new. And even since I've had those since that last session that led to this project, and that has really helped me as a scholar and a researcher and as a writer. And so that's where a lot of that came from. And then this was ultimately most valuable in compiling my literature review. That was a really valuable learning experience for me. And my literature review is where my information for developing my interview questions and things to look for and things to look deeper into, especially in my classroom observations. And they were also just a wealth of suggestions and tips. There were times where I'd just stop at the research assistant desk and say, I have a bit of a dilemma here, what's your suggestion? Or I'm having difficulty finding this, how should I look for it? And they were always super helpful. This also was really helpful when I got done with all of my interviews. I interviewed 10 students in the department and then all 4 political science professors. So by the time I was done, I had 14 interviews. I had about, not all of them were an hour long, but I had about 10 hours of interviews to sift through then. And I got to the point where I was like, how am I going to get through all of this? Because originally Dr. Schreck told us we needed to transcribe all of our interviews. And I'm like, how am I going to do that with 10 hours? In talking to Dr. Schreck and coming to the research assistants, they said, you know what, just read through your notes again, take more notes as you're listening a couple times, because that's going to save you time and energy. And it really did, and I was able to use that on other parts of my project and making my final paper stronger and stuff like that. They were a wealth of knowledge and suggestions that really made this project what it ended up being. So here's just some basic information. I know the text is really difficult. This is just enrollment by major. The political science department has 3 majors: political science, business and political science, and international relations. And enrollment, as you can see, varies greatly, and within that by gender as well. And then here is total enrollment within the department by gender. As you can see, the trends of male and female enrollment, they roughly follow the same trends, and they're honestly very reflective of the gender makeup of our student body anyway. So there's nothing odd there, but I wanted to give a visual representation of that for you all. So some things that came up in my literature review which really influenced how the rest of my project went was the concept of a leaky pipeline. Yes, a lot of women may start out in these feeder professions or in political science majors, but as they move up in career and higher levels of education, there's lower retention rates. And a lot of that has to do with, the next theme I found was the value of role models and mentorship. Scholars have found that where female students have mentors, the retention rates for those students are better. They've especially found this in STEM, And I would argue that the same thing goes for political science, especially since politics and political science also has a legacy of gender disparity and underrepresentation. And then you also have lots of different stereotypes and how our culture socializes men and women differently, and how a lot of us still fall into those stereotypes. And so it's a self-reinforcing cycle, and that creates a very complicated web in which we are operating in general, but in which female students in our department are operating. And then there were also some structural and institutional factors that contribute to that as well. And before I go further, I just want to point out that I'm just looking at one section of a very complicated issue of disparity and underrepresentation. I'm just looking at gender. There's a lot of other ways that this is an issue, especially for people of color, different socioeconomic classes. So I'm just looking at one small part of it, and there's a lot more to it than just this. And that goes for whatever level we're looking at it from. So for my methodology, as I said, I conducted about 14 interviews, and my questions consisted mostly of like what have your experiences been? Have you noticed gendered behavior? How connected do you feel to the department? And what are things that you think our department could do better? And is there an assumed set of knowledge, etc.? Lots of different questions like that, trying to cover as many bases and facets of the student experience as possible. And then I also observed in the classes that I was enrolled in, I kept track of how many male and female students were present each class session, and then how often men and women spoke up. And I really tried to pay attention to the nature of that participation. And then I also tried, because these were classes that I was enrolled in, I did my best to participate as normally as possible as well. And I was often part of that whole process. And then I shared a little bit about my research questions already. And then next, this is the more quantitative part of my qualitative project. And so the main parts to pay attention to here are, there it is, the big blue section, and then the green and the light blue. All of those sections are the percentages of classes where men spoke more than women. Whether they outnumbered the women in the classroom, it was even that day because attendance fluctuates, or when women outnumbered men. And but if you look, this is accounting for, if I looked back on my math, it accounts for about 72% of class periods. Men are participating at higher noticeable rates than women are. And so when you're participating less, you're hearing different perspectives less. Depending on who you're sitting by in small group discussion, you're only going to get certain ideas and certain perspectives. So if you're only sitting with your buddies who are really similar to you, maybe it's all men or all women, then you're getting a very limited perspective on whatever you're talking about in class. So that contributes to that process of very selective and limited participation. So some of my findings, first, I've talked some about that participation and how men are participating more in the very obvious outward ways. This doesn't mean that female students are not participating. And this also is a very simplified method. It doesn't account for introversion, extroversion, and other factors as well. And in talking with the professors about this, they've noticed similar things, and they've described different ways that they try and mitigate some of those imbalances, and some of those in interviews with the students, they found that some of these were very helpful. And ultimately it points to like having a, like everybody should participate this much and this is how it should look, is very absurd, because that's not how dynamic classrooms work, and diverse participation styles and contribution styles in class. This is a very specific way of looking at what's happening. And then there's also some classroom behaviors that came up a lot, both in how female students described how they participate and behave in class, and then what I saw as well. A lot of female students, when they would try and say something in class, they would preface it with, "I'm sorry if this is a silly or stupid question," or they'd apologize, or especially if they were saying something contrary to what somebody else had just said, or trying to play devil's advocate, there's a lot of apology going on. So women don't apologize. So you have a lot of that, and professors notice this as well. And so you have some of that going on, and my interviewees also described that they often feel less comfortable contributing if they don't know anybody else in the class. Once they know people in the class, they're more comfortable contributing. And a lot of that has to do with how they think they're going to be perceived or how their comments will be received. And then also, this really attests to the trends in how women under-assess and underappreciate their own skills and abilities and stuff like that. And they're more likely to under-assess or poorly assess themselves than men are. And so that really attests to that, and that's happening in our student body with our students. And so that means it's happening in other places too. And then some of the challenges that that female students described, not having that female mentorship. And since this project, there's actually been a couple of changes in our department, and there's been some efforts to address that. And that's actually been really exciting to see and participate in. And so that mentorship and talking to another woman about being in a field that is often at least perceived as being hostile to women, even though scholars have found that it's actually a lot less so than we tend to think. But those perceptions often cause women to those perceptions cause women to self-select out of those professions or careers. So even if it's not actually there, the legacy or the impression that it is still has a big effect on people's calculations to pursue a career path, run for public office, etc. And then there are some institutional factors. It's a small department. Our hiring practices and stuff like that play a role in that. So some of it doesn't necessarily have to do with, and it doesn't have anything to do with an intent of we don't want female professors in our department, because that is definitely not the case. It's just how part of how things have played out with applicant pools and how qualified people are, and that also further attests to how self-selection plays a role, and then how people get qualified to teach in higher education. If less women are pursuing degrees and higher leadership, then they're less likely to pursue positions like this, where their presence could be really valuable. And then there were also some assumptions about being in the political science department, how you're supposed to participate in department events, especially for double majors. They described being torn between their two majors, and as a double major myself, I can tell you that that's true. Sometimes you're spread really thin, whether that's going to events or your academic energy and stuff like that. You often are forced to choose between the two, and that can, and I mean, that's part of choosing to double major. Some of that you bring on yourself, but there's challenges that come with that. And then there's assumptions of like, this is what the typical student looks like. These are the things they participate in, etc. And so there's some assumptions about that at least the female students that I interviewed, they don't always fit that mold. And let's see here. And then some more, some of these can definitely be seen very negatively and concerning, and it's not all that. There's many things that our department is actually doing really well, and I'm really pleased to be a part of it. And some of these things came up in relationships within the department and mentorship. Because our department is small, both in students and faculty, there's a lot of opportunity for meaningful relationship with peers and professors. And many of my interviewees attested to the value of that. And then our department, because they're very cognizant of the all-male faculty, they have tried their best to mitigate that through a series of different ways, including connecting female students with female alum, encouraging them to pursue that mentorship in other areas, and then female students have also pursued that themselves, whether that's an internship supervisor or another job or somebody from a different major. There's been opportunities within the department to do that, and then female students have also taken that upon themselves to meet those needs. And so those are some of the really strong areas that I think our department can really build on, and there's some potential there. So some concluding remarks. As I said, there's a variety of challenges that female students often have to mitigate in feeling more integrated in the department and stuff like that. And then I also wanted to talk about some limitations of my project. Again, I was looking at participation in a very specific way, and this doesn't account for everything. And I interviewed 10 students, and I was only able to observe a handful of classes. And so there's limitations to my abilities to cover all of my bases. But I think this shows some of the things that are happening in our department. And this also attests to how Bethel is a product of its time and culture, and a much broader, it's just one part of a much broader web of institutions and structures and culture. So some suggestions that I kind of had, and I really toyed with how much of this I was going to talk about, but that's how I roll. So those of you who know me know that that's true. And so some things that came up with that is increasing opportunities and structures for mentorship. There's a lot of value in going out there and finding mentorship where you need it yourself. And as a very independent and outgoing person, that's pretty easy for me to do. But for a lot of my peers, that's a lot harder. And how that is received coming from a woman is also not always the most positive. So having opportunities much more available and accessible to you makes a huge difference. And that mitigates one of the challenges of getting to that mentorship relationship in the first place. And one way our department has tried to do this even since I first wrote this paper back in spring of 2018 was we have started a new group within our department, and it is geared towards encouraging and equipping women to eventually run for office. And we've tried to also have that be just an opportunity for relationship and mentorship with like younger students to older students. And that's been really exciting to see as well. And then, let's see here. One thing that I also suggested was in other departments across Bethel, there are mentorship programs, and so a way that we can build on what we've already been doing. Maybe we should take some lessons from the business department or the STEM departments, because they do some of that as well, because they've found when women have that mentorship, they're going to do better, they're going to feel more integrated and connected, and stuff like that. So it would behoove us to pursue that further. And then also the value of shared space. Just where our department is located, there's some limits to that. But our department is moving locations within these buildings in the next year or so. So maybe there will be more opportunity for that. And that will be exciting to see as well. And so in conclusion, I just wanted to say, I wanted to extend a couple words of appreciation primarily to my student interviewees. This project would not have existed without them and their willingness to participate and talk through some difficult things in their student experience, but then also reflect on really positive experiences and their contribution and their critical thinking in this, the amount of effort that it took for them to be interviewed and taking that time out of their busy schedules to do that with me really meant a lot. And it really added on our relationships as classmates and friends, and that was really valuable as well. And then to the political science professors and their willingness to be interviewed and talk through and think through some of these things with me as well, and their encouragement in this project. I knew that I wouldn't have to worry about how such an inquiry would be received because of their nature and hospitality. And I was definitely correct in that confidence, and I really appreciate that. And then to Dr. Harley Schreck, he wasn't able to be here today, but he was my professor for the class that I did this for, and his encouragement and help with the project was really, really valuable as well. And then obviously the library, the research librarians, the resources and access to those resources that I had, it would not have been as strong of a project without those resources. And that's why we're here today. So, and then this also had definitely a personal impact, just thinking about my experiences myself and my academic interests. It's kind of changed the trajectory of some of those interests. And then it's also added some self-awareness in how I play into these trends and stereotypes myself, and how I can examine where I can still grow in that as well. And then it's also changed some of my career interests. So it's the learning experience from this has still been ongoing. And it's also led to some other meaningful conversations that have been really valuable. And with that, I will take questions if we have time. Do we have time?
We do.
Okay. Yes.
I was just wondering, I know it wasn't the focus of your research, but in your process of doing research, did you run across any articles that talk about other demographic or philosophical or is there any theological background that might be more unique to Bethel than another place that might have some effect one way or another, or even other demographic things? I was just thinking, you being from Alaska, maybe it's easier for you to be an independent. I'm just curious if you ran across any of those kind of articles.
I didn't see a whole lot in. So your question was, are there other demographic or are there other demographic experiences that were accounted for in some of the articles I came across, or what are some other justifications for some of the things I was looking for? Is that kind of yeah? So I did come across some just because of how I was doing my research and the way I was searching in like JSTOR and stuff like that. I was focusing primarily on gender, or women in politics, women in political science. And so I was searching very specifically because I was looking for something very specific.
Right.
But I mean, I didn't delve into it very deeply, but I definitely did see things that pertain to other demographics, whether that was like for out-of-state students or students of color, etc. And I think there were some. It did definitely prompt some reflection for myself culturally, because I was forced to be independent, moving 3,000 miles away where I knew nobody. I was forced to do that, and not every Bethel student is, especially when so many of them, their family live within like an hour of the school. So that was something that came up, and there was some reflection there as well. Any other questions?
Thank you.
I was just wondering if like any of your findings or the people you interviewed talked specifically about how kind of gender dynamics might be unique within the political science department at a school like Bethel versus at a school that's bigger or doesn't have a religious affiliation.
That definitely did come up in one of the. It came up a couple times with the female student interviews. But it also came up specifically in one of the interviews with the professors, because I asked students how they thought their male peers perceived them, and then I also asked the professors, how do you think male students perceive their female peers? And some cultural things about Bethel did come up, things like the ring by spring and the assumption that a lot of people are here to find the person they're going to marry. A lot of that did come up, and so there are arguably students who view their peers as a potential spouse rather than an academic equal. Dr. May?
Okay, so I'm delighted to be here and hear this wonderful research. I have 2 questions. How did your interview pool break down along race lines?
Mm-hmm.
And then were the women who apologized before sharing their insight of a particular race?
Okay, those are really, really good questions and really important too, like the perspectives that I was getting. If I should have had a list of my interviewees handy so I could specifically look at that. But if I remember correctly, I interviewed 3 students of color. And I have to be very careful about how much I can say about this because I am under the IRB regulations. But if I remember correctly, I interviewed 3 students of color and then 3 Euro-American students. And if I remember correctly, the apology aspect came from about half of them, and that was noticeable in both white students and the women of color. Any other questions? All right.
What were some of the comments that were made within your interviews that you thought were something you were alone in, but you empathized with?
Oh man. Sorry. Definitely with for the students who were double majors, or this was actually really common too in the business and political science majors, because that's technically one major, but you're spread pretty evenly between the 2 departments. And it did come up a little bit with international relations majors as well, because you take a lot of non-political science classes. So the less you're physically present in the department or in those political science classes, and when you're in classes with other majors, so there's less opportunity to interact with your peers and feeling spread thin. That was a really big one. One of my interviewees shared that, and I definitely had a moment of, I never thought about it that way before. And the more I thought about it, I was like, wow, that's really, really true. That was a big one. I'm sure there were others, but that's the one that sticks out to me. Any other questions? Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We're delighted you're here. For those of you who are interested in joining the Friends of the Library, you're more than welcome. Information is available on the Bethel Library website and any of the librarians. Myself, I'm happy to talk with you. Thanks again.